This will be a series read from, or rather referencing Allamah Tabatabai's Kernel of the Kernel, which is one of the most concise and clear works that I have ever read on Saywa Saluk, the practical spirituality of self-purification, or spiritual wayfaring. When it comes to worship upon the path, and by worship I mean the physical and mental practices of spiritual wayfaring, when it comes to this in particular, it should come from the instruction of a master of the path, someone who has already devoted a significant part of their life to Saywa Saluk and to spiritual wayfaring and has demonstrated their ability to assist others in their own spiritual journey. It cannot be stressed enough how important it is to understand this, because what we are discussing is not accessible to everyone, or rather not intended to be accessible to everyone. And that is why I believe it is important that we find a way to discuss these aspects of Islam in a manner that does make these teachings understandable. There is a natural curiosity when it comes to anything that falls under the category of mysticism. And there are Muslims who are uncomfortable with that term. I'm not, but that is because it is a word used by Baba Rajab, a saint of the Bektashi, my tariqah. And if it worked for him, that is sufficient for myself. But it is good to know it is not a term every Muslim believes to be suitable, including people involved in the body of teachings that may qualify as exactly what we are referring to when we say mysticism. And more or less we understand what is being referred to when we say mysticism. So that's the term I'll be using. To return back to my point, there is a consistent curiosity toward mysticism, and particularly Islamic mysticism. And in the case of Islam, this curiosity cannot be placated without directly engaging with the religion to show commitment, and most importantly, to actually have faith and tempering it into conviction and certainty, into yaqeen. I make the argument that when it comes to the religions that for the most part people qualify as a traditional religion, or for one reason or another come to mind when we think about a genuine religion or an organized religion, practically all of which possess a form of mysticism, a tradition of teachings and a process of gradual initiation into those teachings at the guidance of one experience in that process. And none of these were intended to be accessible in the sense that curiosity alone was enough to grant you not only the privilege of learning such teachings, but also it must be understood that these sort of traditions also place a great deal of personal responsibility and self-honesty of those involved in them. And curiosity can only get you so far in that regard. But curiosity in modern notions of independency or individualism often convinces us that to be barred from something when something is interesting to us is not readily available to us, we almost feel insulted or hurt, and we begin justifying unethical means to attain what we have convinced ourselves is being kept from us or hidden from us. That may be true in certain aspects of life and society, but not in Islam, not in Islamic mysticism, not in the practical spirituality and the formal practical spirituality as we see within tariqah, which are carefully guarded and maintained traditions with approaches that are all unique in their own way. It is genuinely remarkable what Allah has enabled us to preserve over so many years, all these centuries, and how carefully these traditions have been looked after. Of course, not in all cases, but we have seen plenty of examples of Islamic teachings being misinterpreted by those who find them useful or just fascinating. Again, just curiosity all across the spectrum of thought. Everything from Salafiyya to Tasawwuf. People have taken these teachings and made them into what they want them to be, what they think they should be, or what they may genuinely interpret them as, but because it's not being informed from a genuine source of knowledge, a source of experience, it's not anything. It's nothing valuable. It's hollow. So I suppose this will be rather a contemplation of Allamah Tabatabai's explanation based on my own experiences and shortcomings with the path, and maybe someone will find that perspective useful, where even when I am wrong, it is understood that this is not speaking on this work with any sort of authority or as a formal explanation of its meaning, which I am genuinely far from qualified to do. But instead, just as I described at first, a reading of a work that I found useful as a reference for the concepts that are the underlying theory of practical spirituality. Theory might not be the best word, but it's what comes to mind at the moment of practical spirituality, of spiritual wayfaring and life upon the path. Allamah Tabatabai, he begins his work after praising God and honoring his messenger and the Ahl Bayt with a description of the state of the human being at the point before they have made their intention towards Sawasaluk, which is described as being within a state of the dark wilderness of materialism, and how in that state we are helplessly pulled between lust and multiplicity. This lust being desire for this world and what it will tempt us with. And it is important to understand that this is the state of man. We don't believe in original sin. We don't inherit sin or guilt. This is a religion to which forgiveness and redemption are foundational as principles, but we should be able to acknowledge the inherent suffering of life within which hardship is unavoidable. Rarely do we live lives that are not touched by a tragedy, and the collective existential crisis many in the modern age are experiencing is, I believe, a part and parcel to this. And that is because that is the purpose of this world, not to suffer, but to be tested, which can be a very unsatisfying answer to some of the existential questions that come with the crises. And this is mostly from the result of us as Muslims beginning to formulate these expectations of what Islam will tell us before we have even asked the question. And by that I mean, when we are wrestling with a matter, whether it is an issue of sin or even of doubt in regards to practice or belief, and we are trying to make sense out of it all and figure it out, and we have a general knowledge of Islam that informs our perspective, but we don't necessarily have the knowledge that clarifies the minutiae that directs the broader perspective into a practical spirituality that helps us fulfill a specific purpose, and that purpose being the purification of the self, which all Muslims engage in daily worship. Though we are discussing what is essentially a life committed to these practices in a much more formal and focused way, all Muslims do experience purification of the self just in the obligations that our Lord has blessed us with. But the point being that when we finally go and ask the religion itself, and this usually is in the form of asking a scholar, or at least someone who we feel is more knowledgeable than ourselves, that even when we do get the correct answer, and we cannot simply fault the delivery of that answer, as we are wont to do as Muslims, in some cases fairly, in some cases not so much, um, that answer that we get does not always align with the answer that we have already begun to build in our mind before we have even asked the question or asked the question through the proper channels. And because this answer has been informed by this general knowledge all Muslims have of Islam, which is usually about the Rahmah, our Lord's compassion, His mercy, and knowledge of His love for His creation, and how that love is the reason we are here, and that Islam is a mercy for us to deliver us from ourselves. All of this is beautiful to know and to have as a foundation for faith, but where Muslims are not, like, we've begun to develop this inherent distrust of anything that resembles something of an establishment within Islam, an institution that gets to determine what is correct or otherwise. It makes us very uncomfortable, and we feel a need to push back against it. So we have a concept that is formed in our mind that is informed by this very basic, important but very basic knowledge of our Lord and His religion. And when we finally accept that we might not have all of the answers, that we might need to ask for guidance on a matter, and we don't accept the answer we get because this concept within our mind has convinced us that our intuition is more correct, and this can begin to this can create a very long cycle of confusion, doubt, and difficulty with faith. And to bring this all back around, Allamah Tabatabai describes the state of man as being of constant assaults from temptation, because this is the nature of this world, in which there is also happiness and contentment, but the believer accepts that these contradictions all go hand in hand, and that they're not contradictions at all, but all part of a formula. And this is why the friends of God are unbothered by suffering, oppression, mockery, and so on, because this has been purified from their heart, because they don't recognize a contention between suffering and happiness. This is a perspective that we can struggle with in our time, as I went into a bit, but it is essential. And without understanding life in this way, I don't know if there is any other way to understand it. It is crucial, at least to this life of spiritual wayfaring. And Allamah Tabatabai, he explains this, describing the blessings that man receives from his Lord, and that through the forgetting of that Lord, they are allowed to become attachments, whether it be wealth or family, which are blessings, and we are encouraged to live modestly but comfortably. We are told to honor our families, but when we forget our purpose in life, or rather the purpose of life, because it isn't about us, we can forget that these are blessings and that they serve a purpose in our life through our responsibilities to them. And so they become distractions, obstacles, and of course our ego, the lower part of ourselves, that is constantly reacting toward our intentions, in particular our intentions in faith, and that ego has not yet been purified. It is not yet under our control. At this point, the wayfarer is not even a wayfarer yet. He's not even a wayfarer yet. We are only discussing the state of the normal human being. So when the ego reacts, it reacts with its best intentions in mind. And much of what it knows, and though we do not carry original sin, as we discussed, we are susceptible to sin. And so that is what the ego craves. Until it has been purified, that is what it craves. So these blessings in life become means by which the ego deceives us. Asceticism and certain forms of attachment, it is fair to point out, I believe, lack in their understanding of our Lord's compassion and how important love is to life. I've heard at times advice given on matters such as these that suggests something along the lines of not even allowing yourself to become too close with your own children, with your family, with your spouse, with friends, to live a life of unnecessary hardship, poverty. When it comes to relationships in particular, I think it's obvious, but this can create many problems. And when we have let people into our lives, especially family, and we do choose how we let our family into our lives, the more our lives become our own, we take on a certain responsibility toward them. And love is a part of that, in making them feel loved. And we all have shortcomings in this regard, and we know it. And so we should be careful of these intense forms of asceticism and worship and such in our own time. There was a time where these very austere lives, where this sort of, this asceticism might have had a purpose, but when it comes to it itself, it's a matter to discuss with your murshid, your sheikh, your spiritual guide, however you may refer to them. They might tell you that that's what you need. They might believe that's exactly what you need, and I haven't heard, really of anything like that in our time. Very often, very rarely, and when you do hear about it, it's usually of a very old and known friend of God who has returned to our Lord, and they're a dying breed. There's not very many of them who still walk this earth. And it may be becoming clear that with how Allamah Tabatabai describes the state of man, and with how subtly we are tested by this world, that existence within this state is something that we would want to be delivered from. But those who do are few and far between. Those who can truly live a life of faith, a spiritual purification, to really live a life of practical spirituality, to make it work, of service and a formal tradition of wayfaring, the teachings of which are coming from those masters who annihilated themselves in God, that they would become like lanterns upon the path. And eventually, for some of us, something gives. We feel what Allamah Tabatabai describes as the divine attraction, this call to a life of faith, to a life of the purification of the self. And this comes. And we have free will, but this is not a door that we open for ourselves. We do get to choose whether or not we walk through it, but we don't open it for ourselves. And it is absolutely important to remember that once we have walked through that door, we do not go back. There is no going back. You do see this happen sometimes in our time. I'm sure it happened in the past. Tariqah hopping. People jumping from one tariqah to another, from one teacher to another, and it's not unheard of for people to have been a part of multiple tariqah. Usually, how that happens is part of their personal spiritual journey. They began with one tariqah and they fulfilled their journey once they had found their place within the tariqah that they were fated for. But we see in our own time like this like I mentioned before, this curiosity, and this curiosity tends to take people anywhere and everywhere. And it's not always going to bring you where you're hoping it's going to bring you to. It's not always going to bring you where you're hoping it's going to bring you to. And it's important to understand, it's crucial to understand that this life is a life that you have to be called to, and you're going to know it when you're called to it. And you're going to know, we will often hear of wayfaring being described as the spiritual warfare, the jihad al-nafs, and that is exactly what it is. When we have made our intention known, toward the ego, that we yearn for self-purification, it takes that as a declaration of war. It's exactly that, it's jihad al-nafs, and it reacts in kind. So when you know that you have felt the divine attraction, you will know, because you will know by the way in which the ego reacts. From here, the wayfarer must recognize their own shortcomings, their own inexperience, to seek a guide, a master of the path, a murshid, someone who is connected in lineage, morals, and character to the Nabi, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in the next of these videos, I believe we'll discuss some of the initial experiences of spiritual wayfaring and follow along with how Allamah Tabatabai has beautifully mapped out these concepts and explained them so clearly, that we can sit here and contemplate this work and draw so much from it, from just a few paragraphs. It's truly remarkable. May Allah have mercy upon the wellsprings of this religion, the men and women of self-purification, and guide us by the knowledge. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, Muhammad, ameen.